So when Europeans first made their way across the Atlantic, it wasn't just a meeting of different peoples. It was really a collision of technologies, of worldviews, and of course, ambitions. Okay, let's get right into this incredible story of how just a handful of new tools didn't just build an empire, but completely remade a continent, with totally different outcomes for everyone involved. Let's start with a number. And it's a number that's, well, it's pretty hard to wrap your head around. 90%. That's the high-end estimate for population loss in some First Nations communities. And this was mostly due to European diseases like smallpox and influenza, things their bodies had absolutely no natural immunity to. And that's the crucial thing to understand here. This isn't a story about Europeans stumbling upon an empty wilderness. Nope. It's the story of their arrival, sparking what historians call one of the biggest demographic catastrophes in all of human history. The land they found wasn't empty. It was in the process of being emptied. And this really shows you what was already here. We're talking about a continent that was just bustling with people, maybe as many as 2 million in the lands that would one day become Canada. And these weren't just scattered tribes. They were sophisticated nations. You had incredibly complex political groups like the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy, which was a powerful union of nations with its own constitution. They had trade routes that stretched across the continent and had been around for thousands of years. So yeah, the whole empty continent idea, it's just a myth. So that brings up a pretty big question, right? How did these relatively small groups of Europeans project so much power all the way across an ocean? Well, the answer, for the most part, comes down to a few key pieces of technology. It really all came down to a sort of technological trifecta. First, you had advanced ships. We're talking about vessels like the Leon Dew that could actually survive a brutal transatlantic voyage. They acted like these floating bases, shuttling people and supplies back and forth to set up permanent settlements like Quebec. Second was precise navigation. Later on, when they figured out how to calculate longitude, explorers could actually map these huge territories accurately and then claim them for their king. And third, and this is a big one, superior firepower. It just completely rewrote the rules of war. What's so interesting is how one single piece of tech could have such a massive impact. Take the arquebus. It was this early type of musket, super heavy, clumsy, not very accurate, but it could fire a lead ball up to 1,000 meters away and blast right through traditional armor. For warriors who'd never seen a firearm before, the sound, the smoke, the sheer destructive force, it was absolutely stunning. It changed the balance on the battlefield like overnight. And this reliance on technology, it really became central to how these empires thought. Like when the English demanded that Quebec surrender back in 1690, the French governor, Count Frontenac, he didn't even bother to negotiate. He famously shot back, "My only reply will be from the mouths of my cannons." It just goes to show you, for Europeans, military technology wasn't just a tool, it was the ultimate symbol of their authority. And that confidence, the kind that's born from the mouths of cannons, it fueled a lot more than just military attacks. It fed a really powerful idea. Europeans started to see their own technology and their own systems as proof that they were culturally superior. And they used that idea to legally justify the right of discovery. Basically, the notion that they could just show up, claim land, and completely override anyone else's claim to it. Okay, but for a second, let's try to look at this from the European side of things. For them, colonization wasn't some sure thing. It was this incredibly high-stakes gamble with enormous risks balanced against the promise of rewards that were almost too big to imagine. So on one side of their balance sheet, you had these huge pull factors. The economic draw of soft gold, beaver pelts, which were all the rage in European fashion, was just immense. Plus, you had timber for the Navy and those unbelievably rich fisheries. Missionaries like the Jesuits saw a spiritual battlefield, a chance to win souls for their faith. But the risks, they were off the charts. Those first winters were just savage. Scurvy and starvation killed massive numbers of the first settlers. These ventures were so expensive, they often bankrupted the private companies that funded them. And of course, it dragged all the old rivalries from Europe across the ocean, turning North America into a constant battleground. All right, now let's flip the coin and look at the other side of this ledger. For the First Nations who had called this place home for thousands of years, the arrival of Europeans and their tech completely remade their world in ways that were at first empowering, but ultimately catastrophic.
In the beginning, there were some clear benefits. European iron tools, things like kettles, axes, knives, they were a total game changer, making everyday life way more efficient. Getting firearms offered huge military advantages against traditional rivals, and some nations, like the Huron-Wendat, became incredibly powerful and rich as middlemen in this new global trade. But the long-term price was just devastating. Beyond the diseases, there was this slow, grinding loss of sovereignty through policies like the Indian Act, a growing economic dependence on European goods, and eventually deliberate policies of cultural erasure, like the residential school system, which were designed to literally stamp out indigenous identity itself.
And this wasn't some accident. That long-term policy of trying to erase cultures was rooted in a very specific way of thinking. It's a concept that some historians call annihilation, the belief that one culture, if it thinks it's superior, has the right to actively destroy another one. It's a really chilling idea, but it helps explain the terrible policies that came after that initial period of trade and cooperation. So what happens when you mix new technologies, competing economic goals, and two fundamentally different worldviews? Well, you get a continent that's transformed by both conflict and collaboration, often at the exact same time. The Beaver Wars in the mid-1600s are a perfect example of this. It all started when French and Dutch traders brought in firearms, a technology that just poured gasoline on traditional rivalries. The Haudenosaunee, who got their guns from the Dutch, then launched this major campaign to try and control the entire fur trade. What followed was decades of brutal warfare that threw the whole region into chaos and led to the complete destruction of major powers like the Huron-Wendat Confederacy. It's a stark reminder of how quickly technology and money could turn partners into enemies. But at the end of the day, this conflict wasn't just about money and guns. It was rooted in a massive clash of worldviews. I mean, two totally different ways of seeing the world colliding. Many indigenous worldviews saw people as just one interconnected part of nature, where society is built on relationships and sharing resources. The Western worldview at the time, it was much more hierarchical. Humans are at the top, meant to dominate nature, and society is all about individual competition and accumulating wealth. When you have that kind of fundamental disagreement, especially over the basic concept of owning land, violent conflict becomes almost unavoidable. And that leaves us with a big final question that kind of hangs in the air. The history we've just looked at is a messy mix of mutual need and brutal conquest, of sharing technology and of total demographic collapse. So when an empire is built on a foundation of both partnership and devastation, who inherits that complicated balance sheet? And how do we even begin to reckon with it today?